Hello and welcome everybody back to the Esoteric Mammoth. In this episode, we interview our guest, Doug Dammann, who serves as an educator at the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and is also a college professor with a deep passion for history. We discuss the Civil War Museum and its distinct approach to portraying history. Unlike many other Civil War museums, Kenosha's museum places a strong emphasis on the everyday life of this period, allowing visitors to make a deeper connection to the past through those who lived through the war, going beyond just the military aspects. We discuss the crucial role that museums play in public education. Doug highlights the immersive learning experience that museums offer, emphasizing the significance of interacting with three-dimensional objects to truly understand historical effects and contexts. And if you ever wanted to work at a museum, we spend some time discussing how it's a great place for people of all backgrounds and skill sets. So if you believe you can't work at a museum just because you didn't get a college degree, or the one that you have you think won't work for a museum, think again. We hit on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and how it reshaped the nation and continues to influence contemporary discussions about civil rights and equality. You'll want to stay tuned to the end, where we discuss one of the museum's most unique artifacts. Spoiler, it's a letter from a young slave girl dating back to 1842. It's an incredible story that recounts the girl's experience with the Underground Railroad. As a fun and lighthearted twist, we touch upon the pop culture representation of museums and movies, with a particular focus on A Night at the Museum. Despite the fantastical elements, we talk about how the movies can inspire interest in history and encourage people to explore real museums. As always, there's a fun assignment for you listeners at the end of the episode. Thank you all for tuning in and staying curious about the world around us. Now, let's talk about the mammoth in the classroom and go beyond what we think we know about the Civil War and what we think we know what it's like to work at a museum.
Joe
and Safo. And today our guest here is Doug Dammann from we're sitting at the Civil War Museum in downtown Kenosha. So
with
Doug,
a wonderful view of Lake Michigan right out the window.
Yeah, thanks guys for coming down and asking me to be on your podcast. This should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, so let's
Definitely
start off by getting to know you. Who are you? What are you doing here?
Well, my name's Doug Dammann. I've worked here at the Civil War Museum as the site coordinator and I think that's my official title, site coordinator, and that spans over the course of the education department, the collections department, a little bit of everything here. And I've been at the museums for 15 years. Came to Kenosha in November of 2007 when this building was still an idea. We were not officially open at that time. The building was up. The exhibits weren't done. We had an overall concept, so we were putting the exhibits together and then working with the educators to come up with a story, how we would interpret the building. So from pretty much day one, this has been one of my big projects, was to figure out with other staff members what the exhibits would be all about and how we would explain them to people and tell them what we were really all about here at the Civil War Museum.
How did that decision come about, from like having a natural history and then Civil War?
Yeah, a lot of people had that question when they first came in 2008 and 2009. Where did the idea come from? Because you don't think Kenosha, Wisconsin, and the American Civil War. We don't have a huge battlefield in our community like at Gettysburg or various communities in Virginia or Mississippi, mostly southern states. So I think the approach became, in 2005 and 2006, Dan Joyce, who was director of exhibits and collections when I got here and then became the director of the Kenosha Public Museums a few years later, and other staff members, along with the mayor here in Kenosha, had an idea for this project, a Civil War-themed museum. And through discussions and through different venues and talking with people, they realized, the thing that's missing in the Civil War community and what's not talked about a lot is the impact and the role of the upper Midwest during the Civil War. What were communities like at the time? What were the experiences of the soldiers? What were the experiences of the civilians? How did the upper Midwestern states contribute to the Union war effort? Because I think if you read a lot of the narratives or go to a lot of the National Park Service sites, the upper Midwest kind of gets lost in the shuffle. You get the impression from a lot of these that men from New York and Pennsylvania and the East Coast were the main driving force behind the Union Army. We wanted to change that narrative and tell the story of the people from our area, from our region, and how they impacted the war. So that's really the main idea that I stepped into that was already established by the time I got here in 2007.
So would you kind of say that the exhibits here are something different than somebody would find in those like battleground states, or like you said, more of the southern states? Would the museum here offer a unique kind of learning experience compared to what you might typically see in a Civil War museum?
Yeah, I think so. In two factors: the overall narrative of the Upper Midwest. I think that having that regional look at it, it's not a local Kenosha look. It's not even a Wisconsin narrative. It's more of a 7-state regional narrative. And then the fact that we don't have that battlefield nearby. You're not going to come here and learn more about a single battle like Vicksburg or Antietam or Gettysburg, name your Civil War battle. But what you're going to learn about was more of an experiential, broader view of a region and the impact what happened during those war years, how it impacted the people who participated or lived in this region. So, yeah, I would think it's rather unique.
So you yourself, what is your background? Your focus is on the Civil War. You're a historian, correct?
Correct. Yeah, growing up, my dad had collected objects related to the Union Medical Department. For longer than I've been on Earth, he's been at this. And I was born in 1974, so I'm 48 years old. And in our home, in a small town in northwest Illinois, my dad had this amazing collection of things that belonged to Union surgeons and nurses, photographs, surgical kits, medical chests. I mean, oddball stuff that he had. And my mother put up with this. I mean, he was a dentist by trade, so this was...
I was going to ask, did he have some sort of medical...
Yeah.
He was in the medical field, so then that
he
furthered his interest in it.
Correct. Yeah, he was a dentist, always interested in the Civil War from a high school on. And when he started collecting things regarding the Civil War, he kind of noticed in the early 70s that there was this... No one really wanted the medical side of the story. He would go to different Civil War shows or talk to people in the business that were selling this stuff, and there wasn't really a market for it. And so he was kind of the lone person that was interested in it, and that's really morphed. I think a lot of people in the last 30, 40 years have gotten really into the Civil War, the medical side of it. So through my dad's interest and his collecting, we were constantly going. Summer vacations, we would go to Gettysburg. He would take his collection. He would show it off at these shows for a weekend, and we'd pack it all up in the family truckster and bring it back to Illinois. From those experiences, I really grew to like the American Civil War. I enjoyed studying it with him. Part of it was probably, father-son bonding time. We'd go out in the mornings and walk the battlefield, and there were other things involved in those vacations, but for me, it stuck. My brother, he was also along with it. It didn't stick with him, and the interest just really wasn't there. And then I think, secondly, out of my dad's interest, but then I think if you talk to people who maybe get into any sort of profession, there's often an educator or a teacher that furthers that interest, right?
Yeah, that's what we're really interested in hearing about.
Yeah, I had a high school teacher that I really enjoyed. American history class, junior and senior year. I liked the class. And when I was thinking about what can I do with this interest? Where can this all take me? I ended up going to a place called Kalamazoo College in Kalamazoo, Michigan. It had a really strong history department. And their curriculum at Kalamazoo was really different. We were on a 10-week quarter system, and it was a year-round curriculum. It wasn't just you go to school on Labor Day and you're done by Memorial Day, and then you're off in the summer. We had four quarters, and we were on constantly, meaning that I had the opportunity to go abroad and study in Madrid for 10 weeks, and then the ability to do what they called it career development quarters, 2 semesters from January until May of my junior year. Now, a lot of people do internships while they're in college, and I don't think Kalamazoo was unique in that regard. But what was unique was the timing. I did a 6-month internship with the National Park Service out at Harper's Ferry in West Virginia, which is just up the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., about 40, 50 miles up the river. But I was able to do it from January until May. And I was the only college intern that was on the park at that time. And so I worked with the cultural resource manager and the chief curator at the park. I was in their office. And I got a lot of personal attention from both of them. We worked on projects together. If anything interesting was going on in their daily, career, they'd, hey, Doug, come on, let's go check this out. Come, let's get out of the office and go do this. So I think the fact that I was able to do that for that 6-month time frame from January, when it was kind of desolate in the park. There weren't a lot of people there except on weekends. But I was the lone intern. And so I got those experiences with them. And that kind of showed me, hey, this museum stuff, this public history side of things is really what I want to do.
Wow. That's cool.
We were actually just talking a little bit about West Virginia on the way here, which is kind of funny. So
in what way?
They're like cryptids. So like
more like
Mothman.
the mythos type stuff. But
Yeah.
Okay.
and I'd be kind of curious. I mean, not that we're here to interview about the Civil War per se, but I'd be curious because West Virginia was probably a unique area during the war.
Well, yeah, Harper's Ferry especially. I mean, if you go there, it's where the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers come together and it flows on down. Physically, it's very beautiful. I mean, there's that part of it. There's history that dates back to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and the founding of the country. They had a huge arsenal and armory there where they made weaponry from very early on. And then it's got this whole Civil War and the John Brown raid on that armory and arsenal prior to the Civil War was really the match, I think, that sparked the American Civil War. So there's so many layers of things to see and do at that park. And the fact that it was Virginia in 1861. I mean, West Virginia didn't exist until 1863. And so there's still that kind of ongoing, well, is it part of Virginia? Is it, what's really going on here? But it's a great place. If any of your people are interested in visiting, I highly recommend it. It's an amazing spot.
Have you ever done one of those Civil War reenactments?
No.
No.
That's one aspect of that kind of public history, living history when in regards to the Civil War. It's very popular. I was never a reenactor. I never did it. I certainly have a lot of friends and people that we've worked with here at the museum to put on living history presentations. And for a lot of our visitors, it's a very powerful way to experience the Civil War.
Did your dad ever do it?
He did.
Yeah?
Yeah. He portrayed a surgeon and he would go out in the field.
That
and
makes sense.
he would do this stuff. For me, I enjoy certainly getting out and doing outreach programs and doing that whole public history side of it. But I've never taken on a first-person persona or taken on the character or done any of the living history.
Probably safe to assume that you've seen quite a few reenactments, though.
Yeah, and we've hosted
They
them
do
here.
them here, right?
Yeah, I was going to say you have a lot of space to do it out front here. So
Yeah, the challenge here is really, we're in the city of Kenosha, right? And we're spatially, when you go to those, you really have to suspend belief in a lot of different ways. And if you're at a place like, I know they used to do one in Lake County, and there's one here in Wisconsin that the state of Wisconsin does really well. You're kind of in that urban, or not in an urban, you're in a rural environment or in the woods. The things we've done here have more been like encampments. We haven't done a physical battle or anything like that because we're right here by the lake. There's constant traffic going by. We don't have a ton of room for people to move around, but we've done things for students and for the general public that have been successful and a lot of fun.
I feel like they're always going to be relevant because to be able to recreate what it was like, just to step into it, it's even more visceral than watching a documentary or even listening to something like this, a podcast. I've never actually gone to a full blown.
Me neither. I don't know much about them.
Reenactment, but
See them in movies all the time.
but I know what I have learned is that they, the people that do it, they take it very seriously, and they're all about preserving the accuracy of the time and the nature of everything, which fascinates me.
The thing that I liked that we've done here, again, not doing so much on the military history side, but just the day-to-day life of the soldier. I find that people can relate to their own experiences with history. And I think the day-to-day life of the soldier, how do they prepare a meal? What were they eating? Now, not a lot of us can relate to what it is like to serve in combat, right? How would you react to that situation in a battlefield situation? But we can all relate to preparing a meal and eating and making those value judgments between what Civil War soldiers ate and how they prepared their food, where they got the food, versus our own diet today. It's a way to make that one-to-one connection and personalize it for people. And I think the medical side of it, too, is another way that, again, we can all judge our own experiences with healthcare and the medical profession today with what's being provided, or what was being provided to Civil War soldiers, and make value judgments. And that way we can have that way to personalize it and compare and contrast with our own personal experiences. And I think that's a powerful way to learn.
It is. I'm really into like herbology and stuff like that, and I think I've seen a few things about like the certain herbs, like weeds. You know, they would call weeds that were used in the battlefield to like help the soldiers with their wounds and dress their wounds.
Yeah, there were a lot of natural remedies that
the
would
natural
have been
remedies.
You would have been well better off using natural remedies at that time frame than the prepared stuff that surgeons sometimes prescribed for illnesses. A lot of the things that were pharmaceutically created medicines during the Civil War are incredibly toxic that we know today. You wouldn't even really want to touch them, much less ingest them. Things that were based with mercury compounds, treating men with diarrhea or illnesses, stuff like that it's incredibly toxic, incredibly harmful to your system. The more natural, more, I guess, easier on the system, you're better off. Non-toxic things were probably the way to go. Most of what they had as far as medicinal remedies, you wouldn't really want to ingest them at all at the time.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point that you brought up about how looking at just the day-to-day type of stuff versus, I mean, everybody thinks of Civil War and you think of, huge bloody battles and all that. But I think it is interesting to kind of shift the focus to the things, like you said, just preparing a meal, what it was like. Because then I think it does personalize it, and maybe people observing can say, oh, well, these people weren't, not so unlike
different.
us today.
Exactly.
They had to feed themselves. They had to worry about these basic things. And, the battle was, in the grander scheme of thing, the battle itself was actually a much smaller fraction of time they spent fighting than they did just trying to live.
Yeah, you hit on it exactly. The majority of the time, the Civil War soldier would not have spent in time of battle. They would have been in camp. And I think one of the big things are surprised to learn when they come to the museum, and one of the things we emphasize in our group programs is, statistically, it's bantered and debated today that the more popular statistic about the number of people who died during the Civil War, I've heard about 620,000 men died during the Civil War. Some historians are rethinking that, looking at census records and different sources. I've seen it as high as 750,000. But what isn't up for debate is that 2 out of every 3 soldiers died of disease, not of battlefield wounds, not of shrapnel, not of bullets, saber wounds. Diarrhea and dysentery were the 2 biggest killers during the Civil War. And so their time in camp was actually the deadliest time and the deadliest experiences that they had. So it kind of flips what we think would be, all right, most men would die in combat. But no, it was actually, you had a much higher percentage of men dying of non-combat diseases or things than they would have in combat.
So speaking to your teacher part of you, do you get excited when you see that little light bulb of people being surprised that that's the fact?
Yeah, I think changing thought processes, right? Combating myths that we all have and we've learned through different sources or movies or different things, that we all bring things with us when we come into a museum or to a class or when we pick up a book, right? And the big one for me, the other kind of aha moment, and I would say that 95% of the people who come to our museum come in with the attitude, again, on the medical side, that surgeons didn't have anesthesia, that patients who underwent some sort of surgery or medical procedure did it while they were awake. But records show that I think 85 to 90% of the operations that took place during the Civil War were while the patient was anesthetized using ether or chloroform. They'd pour it on a rag, they'd put it over the patient's nose and mouth, and they would be anesthetized for a short amount of time so they would be insensible to the overall pain of the operation. Now, where do people get that information, and where do they bring it with them from? And I think a lot of it has to do with movies. Think of some of the more popular Civil War movies that are out there. Gone with the Wind, I think, emphasizes there's a medical scene where that they're showing surgery. The movie Glory at the very beginning with Matthew Broderick in the 54th Massachusetts. He's after the Battle of Antietam. He's in a field hospital, and the patient is being worked on while he's not anesthetized. And so I think a lot of people take what they see in a film and think, oh, that must be historically correct. That's the way it was. Now, I can't sit here and say, well, yeah, every single operation took place while the patient was anesthetized. That wouldn't be true either. But the vast majority of the time, they were. And so whether it be a school group or an adult group or whomever, that you can see that people go, oh, yeah, now that makes sense. I've never thought about it like that. And we get that at a couple of different locations in the museum. But that's one of my favorite kind of myth-busting opportunities is to talk about that.
Yeah, I'd imagine you can kind of look at anybody walking in the door as a potential, somebody to educate a little bit better. And it is a little, it's because we have spoken to a film instructor, and we were talking about stuff like that, about what the movies portray versus what it really was like. And I don't know, in some ways it's a little scary that people could have this perception of history based on just a movie, and that they're, as far as they know, that this is how things were. And
getting their information from entertainment, which is museums, they're a form of entertainment, but you get like the truth, you get the actual facts. So museums are so important.
Well, the thing that really attracted me, going back to like where this all came from and how I ended up here, the thing about public history is, and this goes for any sort of museum, whether you're an art museum or a history museum, a science and technology museum, this is a leisure time activity. So the majority of the people who come to your site are there because they want to be. They're coming because they think, I want to learn something. This is a great way to spend time with my family. They're here on their own accord. They don't have to be here. It's not like taking a college course where you pay your tuition and from 1 to 2:30, I've got such and such a course. They're here largely because they've chosen to be here. But you never know, especially with a museum like the Civil War, what prior knowledge people are going to bring with them when they walk through your door. Some people come, it's summertime, it's hot outside, they've just got off the beach, they're looking for air conditioning and in a bathroom, right? And they may or may not be aware that the Civil War was fought from 1861 to 1865. Now you've got the other side of the coin where maybe someone has an ancestor who served in a Wisconsin or Illinois regiment, and they know everything there is to know about where that regiment was, what the experience of their ancestor was. They really dived deep into that experience, and they know a lot about the Civil War. Our charge here as a public historian is to make sure that both of those groups that come through the museum learn something new. Maybe you spark an interest in that person that doesn't really realize why should a Civil War museum be here. They don't really know much about it. They come through and they pick up one or two aspects from looking at the artifacts or reading the interpretation or seeing the film, and they want to know more. It inspires them to go out to the public library and check out a book or pick something up from the museum store downstairs. It gives them that spark. I just want to know more about this. I've never thought about that topic in this way. And then for that person that spent a lot of their waking hours studying this, maybe you're approaching this topic from a different angle that they've never considered before. And so that sparks this new interest in a different way. So that's what's so cool, I think, about public history is you just never know who your audience is, and you don't know what they're bringing with them when they come to your site.
Yeah, it speaks volumes about you, being so adaptive to that. You also teach college, but here at the museum, like you said, you never know who's coming in with what compared to, if you are teaching at a college or a school, you kind of can make an assumption that, they probably had these classes,
Right.
They probably know this and this. But yeah, somebody coming in off the lake, you don't even know if they went to school.
Right, and then working in either whether it's a school environment, primary, secondary, college, whatever. You know, you have them from, our class meets from 1 to 2:30. We've got a set amount of time. We've got, like you said, there's often prerequisites to take the class, or there's a reading list that you hope the students have hit before they got there. Here, it's, you never know. You don't know what people are going to bring with them when they walk through, and there's not an entrance exam, nor is there an exit exam. So sometimes with museums, it's tricky to know, okay, are we achieving our goal? Are people learning things? What are they taking away with them? Now, you can evaluate things. You can evaluate the amount of time that someone spends in an exhibit. You can do exit interviews with them. There are different ways to evaluate an exhibit or an experience. But it's difficult to hit everybody who comes through your site.
Yeah, and with obviously with this show, really about exploring the deeper meanings of things. I think that's really cool that you could have one individual walk through the door, and maybe somebody that never really thought they were that interested in the Civil War, and maybe walk out of here having this whole thing ignited where they're like, wow, I didn't realize. It's like, I'm going to start reading up about this. And somebody who kind of goes from 0 to 100 just from their experience here, and then you might get somebody who's Civil War buff, Civil War junkie that comes in and maybe learn something. They think they're the know-it-all in the whole matter, but then they come in and maybe learn something they never knew before either. So.
Yeah, and it expands their horizon or view a little bit. And I think the one thing that I really like about our museum here is we don't just emphasize the military aspect of it. I think you're going to when you come to the site, you're going to walk away with a larger appreciation, even for people that maybe their experience during the Civil War, because of gender or age or whatever, they didn't serve in the military. But that doesn't mean that this what happened in the United States from 1861 to 1865 didn't change their life, their family, or their community. And so the museum is more than just a look at the military experience and the soldier experience of the Upper Midwest. I'd like to think that it really touches on the civilian side of it too, and what changed within society, what happens within families, what happens in politics, what happens in the local communities. So I think for someone that, hey, the military is just not my bag, I'm not interested in it, how many miles these guys marched or in battle, what tactics were used, or the weaponry, that's not really what they're all about. I think people will really invest in stories about people here. You're going to learn more about individual stories, how it affected individuals. And I think that people, when you talk about individuals and you can make those connections to your own personal life, I believe that people are going to retain that information more. And when they walk away, we're not going to teach everything there is to know about the Upper Midwestern experience in the Civil War for someone that comes here. We hope to spark that, that future learning, that lifelong interest, maybe change thought a little bit, change the perceptions, change the way people think in some small way, but also interest them, have them realize that, hey, I didn't think I was going to be interested in this topic at all, but that museum, they approached it in a manner that, yeah, it was interesting for me. I did see myself in some regard in that interpretation.
And that's a good point too, because when you walk up to the museum, you see Civil War museum. I think most people might assume like, oh, this is just going to be battles and military, and then it is surprising when you go down there. I was telling him, he hasn't been here before, but like the exhibits are cool, like where you can sit next to some of the people on a train, and hear their stories. You're like, oh, well, this is different. It's not just war and battles.
Yeah, it's kind of a slice of history of just not just, again, military stuff, but
just that era.
Yeah, the era. And I think it can be maybe have relevancy today, because there's people in modern times that have dealt with somebody going off to war. And I mean, it's, thinking of the Civil War and how many families did have sons, multiple sons go off to be in the war, and how it split families up, or even the instances where, like, I can't quote anything verbatim, but I know that there was even instances where maybe, one family member was on the Confederate side, and family was on the Union side. So imagine how that would have been living back home. You're not you're not fighting, but like it's still tearing your family apart. And how do you deal with that? Like you said, these social aspects of just living through that time.
Yeah. And one of the other things that we often talk about when groups come. This was a large immigrant community prior to the Civil War. I mean, Wisconsin became a state in 1848. In 1860, 1/3 of the population wasn't born in the United States. So a large foreign-born immigrant population was moving to the upper Midwest. And so in places like Milwaukee or Chicago, the percentage was even higher. Over 50% of the population living in those urban environments was often foreign-born, with newspaper publications in German or not in English. And so for our audience today, that, again, making that personal connection, maybe they are first-generation American, and in their household, news and information is gotten, and it's more comfortable for someone to listen to ESPN Deportes or a radio station that's not in English. And they can learn about what these immigrants in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s coming to the upper Midwest about their experience and say, you know what, that really parallels my own experience or my family's experience coming to this, moving to the United States, or simply someone who's moved in life at all. I often ask the question of groups, well, have you ever moved before? And sometimes a few hands go up, and I'll ask, what was the motivation behind moving to a new community? Maybe a new job, a better school district, more opportunity for owning a home. And so all the motivations that we have personally for like moving to a new community and what motivates us to move maybe around the country or maybe even within the Midwest, you're going to find those same motivations are what brought people to the upper Midwest during or prior to the Civil War. So again, we have a lot in common with these stories, these people stories that we emphasize downstairs. And I think that's, again, you're hearing me say it over and over, making that personal connection is important, because I think that is going to lead to interest, and that's going to lead to retention of the information that's being provided.
So what age groups do you, what's the youngest age group you get in here?
Our programming starts at usually around 4th or 5th grade. We have done programs for kids younger than that. 4th and 5th grade, and then in middle school, you find a lot of the middle school students, they're studying the Civil War at that time, and then into the high schools as well. So it's funny that the 3 museums that we have here at the public museums all kind of have their own personalities for what the interpretation is, what the collection's all about. And that when it comes to school groups and education, they often have their own personalities with the age groups that come. The Dinosaur Museum, you talk to Dr. Carr, we often get the younger students, pre-K through 2nd, 3rd grade. At the Kenosha Public Museum, we get a lot of 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade students. And then here at the Civil War, it's kind of 4th and 5th into middle school. So sometimes the schools that come, you often see the kids kind of graduate from museum to museum. A certain school, they'll come to the Dinosaur Museum when they're really younger, early learners. Then they get into the 2nd and 3rd grade, they go to the public museum, and then as they get older, you find them over here. So that's really kind of neat to see as they kind of move through their own educational experience. There are opportunities to reinforce what they're learning in the classroom by coming to one of the 3 museums. And that's one of the things that really attracted me to coming to Kenosha was the fact that the community has really made an investment in these museums. For your listeners who've never been here, I mean, these are 3 world-class museums, and that often is surprising to people when they come to them for the first time, to see the scope of the buildings, the collections.
This is Smithsonian recognized.
Yeah, we're Smithsonian affiliates, so it's we do things correctly from a collections standpoint, and exhibit standpoint. We're really proud when we go out and talk to other people that are in the museum business. I know that we're right there with all of the benchmarks for collections care and education and how we take care of everything. But it's really unique for a community a size of 100,000 people like Kenosha to have these 3 facilities here. So
you would normally expect it out of maybe Madison, Milwaukee, or something, but the fact that it's
Kenosha
here is pretty cool, and it's something that anybody from Chicago or Milwaukee area can get to relatively, easily. It's kind of in between,
right?
Almost. So
yeah,
definitely something to check out. And I admit I haven't toured the whole thing. Well, as we were walking over here, I was like, I want to go peek at that. So we're gonna have to make a point of
Yeah, come on back. I'll
Make
show
a
you.
point
around.
of- one thing we asked this about to Dr. Carr and kind of what your response would be to somebody who would just kind of ask the question, well, why do we need to learn about the Civil War? What does it matter today? Yeah, I know it was a big war and it was important, but of course, us sitting here, we know the importance of this. But how would you respond to somebody like that? What do you feel is what is the most to be learned or gained from studying, a conflict that occurred, over a century, almost a century and a half ago?
Yeah, I think it's really, you can't understand American society today without really knowing what happened at that pivotal time period. And the two big takeaways, we often ask groups when they come, and I'll say to the students, all right, who cares? Why are we still studying this?
Yeah, exactly.
We've just gone through this. We've talked about the pre-war aspects, people moving to these communities, what was going on with different ethnicities, different groups moving to the upper Midwest. We've talked about the Underground Railroad, the experience of free African Americans living in the upper Midwest, or people traveling the Underground Railroad through the upper Midwest, the experiences of the soldiers. What's this all about? Why do we still care? And for me, the two big takeaways of the Civil War are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. First of all, the Civil War amendments. The 13th Amendment passed in 1865, abolishing slavery once and for all, right? And for the 3 to 4 million enslaved people living in the South, they have their freedom. This is the moment. The 14th Amendment gives citizenship to anyone that was born in the United States. So before that, enslaved people didn't have any rights, didn't have citizenship rights. That extends that to them, and it's still being talked about today. The 14th Amendment is still something that pops up from time to time. And then the 15th Amendment giving African American men the right to vote. So you see this huge change in American society because of what happened during the Civil War. And then you see the progression in American history from Jim Crow to segregation to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, and even to what's going on in America today. They're all linked together. There's a grounding there, and I don't think you can really understand one without understanding that progression and that link. So for me, that's a big deal. And then the other part of it is secession. The United States was splitting apart at this time, and the southern states were serious about it. I think a lot of people kind of come in and think, well, okay, I understand it was northern states versus southern states, but were they really serious about it? And yeah, if you think about it, if Lincoln at the time and some of his advisors were saying, you know what, just let them go, let them secede, let them create their own nation. You'd need a passport to cross from Ohio or the upper Midwestern states into the southern states. They were going to create their own nation. And they were serious about it. They had a constitution, a president, a very effective army, and a large economy at that time. So reunification of the country, bringing it together. And, if you think about the writing of the Constitution from someone who was around in the United States in 1860, that wasn't that long ago that was written. And this grand experiment here of this United States, this nation, would it last? And I think a lot of European nations at that time would have pointed to the Civil War saying, look, see, we told you this will never last. This experiment is ridiculous. It's going to tear itself up from the inside. And here's the example of it. And so the reunification of the United States and all the aftermath that came with it, to me, are the two big takeaways of this. And why do we still care? Why are we still studying this? So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that was inspiring. I really
Well,
like
just
that.
the fact that, it does matter today because some of those issues are still just as relevant. And I always like to point out how sometimes I don't think people realize how young the United States actually are in comparison to some countries that are just been a country for so long. But you look at today, I mean, when you turn on the TV, especially when it's the height of an election year, you're seeing everything's all about red versus blue, and everything's just kind of one side or the other. And I think that still things from the Civil War age still kind of hold relevance. That there's always this kind of, I don't think it's good to look at everything and there's only two sides. and it's always an us versus them. But I think that narrative likes to get spun a lot, even today. So I think that's one of the relevancies of studying a time like the Civil War, because that was the extreme of it, where, like you said, literally some states were just becoming a whole separate nation. And, I think you even hear once in a while, could it happen again, or could things like this occur, or, a state breaking off, or, so it's
like surprising to think about. I think it goes back to like connecting us to the past and saying, oh, they're not so different. Like, yeah, what would it be like if that was actually happening today? How crazy would that be?
Yeah, I think sometimes you can look at history and the events of the past as predictors too, and recognize certain things that are and use that as almost like a predictor for what might happen in the coming months. So having that grounding, knowing it, allows you to maybe see that future for what might be coming down the road, and be wary of that as well.
Yeah, almost to kind of like just everybody, myself in my own occupational life, or just in career or personal situations, we'll make a mistake, but I guess the best thing to try to do is learn from that mistake and be better informed and prepared later. So there's already been an event like this, the Civil War, so I think it provides a lot of not to compare that as being a mistake or something, but to look at an event like that and say, hey, this is something that actually happened. Let's use that knowledge there to be able to navigate, what comes ahead. To know,
not
like,
that history repeats, but it does rhyme a little bit.
Right, and what were the steps that led to this? What do we see happening even pre-war? Some of the things that we need to be wary of, maybe in our own society, about. Hey, we need to be aware that these were the steps that it took that got us to this point. Yeah. Let's be cognizant of that and be aware of that, and so possibly seeing that and just being aware of it, I think, is important.
And I guess getting into a philosophical side of it, I guess people could debate, would it, I think anybody could agree avoiding a war would be ideal, but then you could also spin it and say, well, look at the good things that came out of it. Like you said, the 13th through the 15th Amendments, those are good things that resulted. Had the war not happened, would those have occurred? So it gets into that subjective philosophical part, but I would think that going ahead, I think as a people, you would want to avoid an event, a conflict like the Civil War again. But then it opens up that whole side door of like, well, would it be so bad? And that's a slippery discussion that probably for a different podcast. But
well, let's talk about.
But it's the deeper meaning is what I'm getting at. Is that there are so many other layers to it.
Let's talk about you as a college professor. Okay. So what is your degree in officially, and like what do you teach?
Well, I have my history degree from Kalamazoo, an undergrad, a Bachelor of Science in American History, and then a master's degree in Museum Studies from Eastern Illinois University. And I was approached by Parkside here in University of Wisconsin, Parkside, here in town. One of my colleagues at the museum, Gina Redant, had taught an introductory to museum studies course at Parkside under Dr. Bob Sasso in their Soc Anthro department. And Dr. Sasso approached me and said, would you be interested in doing this? And I thought, well, yeah, I would. It'd be kind of cool. I've never done that before. I've certainly taught in an informal level here with groups that have come in and done single-off programs or presentations or workshops here at the museum. But here was an opportunity to do, 15, 16 weeks, full semester with college undergrads, and introduce them to the museum business, because we've had a lot of student interest, people coming, asking about internships here at the museum. What would it take to get into this? I'm interested in history, and I had these own questions in my own mind when I was an undergrad. I'm interested in the United States history. I'm majoring in history. Now, how do I turn that into a career? How do I make a living from that? What are my options? And a lot of my fellow students at Kalamazoo, they went to law school. They used a history degree to get to law school, or they teach in a high school or middle school or whatever. And that was great. But how could I use this? And my answer was I wanted to use it in museums. And so how can I help fellow undergrads take that first step in maybe their own career? Because what I often heard when students would call us and say, do you have any internship possibilities? And the answer would be, yeah, we've hosted interns here before. Many times the answer was, when I'd ask them, well, what are you interested in when it comes to museum work? And the answer was often, I don't know, I just want to work at a museum. My goal and always say this, and I think I taught the course there 7 or 8 times at Parkside. I don't really remember. The first day, my goal for the students was when they had that opportunity for that first internship interview or the phone call with a curator or someone at a site that they were interested in, if that question was asked, what do you want to do at the museum? That student would say, because I had this intro class at Parkside, I know the different departments and what goes on at a museum. I know my own personal interests and personality. And I can say, well, I'm more interested in a collection side of it. Or I like teaching, so I'm more in the education side. Or I like fundraising. I could be more in the development side. Rather than the answer being, I don't know, I just want to work at a museum. For me, on the other end of that telephone call, if I had a student that gave me that answer, I would say, aha, this is someone who's serious about this as a profession. They've given it some thought. They have some background in museums and what goes on there. And I'm interested in this person. That's necessarily going to elevate them from maybe if there's other people that are interested in that same position or that same internship. So that intro class it provides kind of a wide look at what goes on at a museum, what sort of functions and tasks go on, what sort of skills are needed, and then how does that translate into maybe what a student brings with them to that class, so that they could answer that question, but also reflect on it and know, if you're not a person that is comfortable teaching 3rd and 4th grade students, you're more comfortable doing collections work, kind of behind the scenes stuff. Maybe an internship that's tailored toward the education department, that's not for you. You got to know what your strengths are and what you want to do. And so maybe it helps them avoid a bad experience in the workplace.
Well, when I was an intern here, I think I got like a good cross-section of everything. I was mainly collections, but I do remember participating in helping the little kids program downstairs or over at KPM. Just a bunch of stuff, cleaning, gallery sitting, curation. I really like curating. I think if I was to go full steam ahead in museum work, it would be something like that, like designing the exhibits.
And that's something too you got to think about. Not all museums are created equally. You've got some organizations like Smithsonian that are very large organizations with big budgets with a lot of people that work there. I know I used to work there. I worked at the Air and Space Museum for 7 years. And you're very specialized at an organization like that. You're in collections, or you're in development, or you're in exhibits. And in an organization like that, you don't necessarily stray from that focus. And for some people, that's awesome. That's exactly what I want to do. At Air and Space, maybe you were a former pilot from the Air Force or the Navy, and you just wanted to work with the collection side of the aircraft, and you don't really have an interest in working with the general public. But for other people, you have a personality that you want to be more varied in your career. And at a smaller museum with less staff, there are some historical societies out there where you might be a staff of one full-time person and then have a couple of part-time people that come in and help you out. Well, if you think you're going to be specialized in one area of that experience, you're mistaken, because one day you're going to be teaching kids. One day you're going to be working with the collection. One day you're going to be doing budgets. One day you might be cleaning the bathrooms. I mean, that kind of jack of all trades experience, maybe that speaks to you. And if you just did the same thing day after day after day, if you were so specialized like in collections, that wouldn't be what your career aspirations would be. So maybe a smaller organization where you get to do all of that stuff, it's so varied from day to day, that appeals to you. Maybe for somebody else, no, I want to do just the one and be really good at this one aspect. So not only knowing like where you want to be within the museum, but where you fit, where your personality fits in the larger scheme. Like, where do you want to be? Those are some of the things that we talked about with that intro class at Parkside. And it was really fun for me personally to guide the students through this stuff and give them that given my experiences, I'm sure at that class, they all got tired of me talking about, well, this is what I did. But I found that, again, my own experiences would help with their choice, and how can I help them understand what best fits their personality and what their career goals are.
Yeah, I think that's really important to. I mean, we're always interested in hearing how somebody got into the educational role. Some people that was their plan, but you it sort of came later on. It wasn't, like you said, the opportunity came up, and I think it's really interesting how some people end up in that instructor, educator role. But I also think it's really valuable to help students not just sit there and teach them about something like here's what you need to know to pass this quiz or test, but to actually help them think about, what do I want to do with a career going forward? Not just think about, I want to be in a museum,
right.
But think about, well, no, what do you like to do? Do you like to deal with people, or do you like to not deal with people
right.
and be in a room by yourself and just handle the objects? And I think that's really valuable. It gets overlooked, and I feel like I didn't have enough of that when I was, getting to the tail end of high school, where, because I got out and I don't know what I want to do. I figured it out eventually, but I think that's a valuable opportunity to be an educator. And I think maybe it's better that some people who didn't plan to go be in the classroom, that kind of ended up there, have a different perspective on what the subject is that they teach, or the field that they're in, that they come from a career standpoint, and I think they can offer that insight. I feel like that's how you, just from your story about your first day of the class, I think it's a really valuable point.
And then the other thing too that I always share with the students is, when you're going out looking for that initial internship or job opportunity, don't think that any experience that you had in life doesn't apply to working at a museum, because the museum world is so varied. And I use my own example, 2 examples. In high school, I took shop class, right? And we wood shop. I figured, okay, someday I might own my own house. I might need to know how to use power tools. So I thought, and I don't want to cut my fingers off. So I took shop. I thought it'd be fun. So I learned to run a table saw. I learned how to use a planer and sanders and things like that. Well, when I got to apply to the job at the Air and Space Museum, we made a lot of very custom exhibit mounts and crates and cradling for things that were going to go either to be shipped across the country and around the globe, or to be put in storage or placed on exhibit. And the fact that I came to that job with some rudimentary knowledge, I was no master wood craftsman by any means, but I knew my way around a little bit around that wood shop, and I could, do it safely. That might have put me, that experience would elevate you over someone else that's also applying for that job. So students may think, I took this class in high school and it has absolutely nothing to do with working in a museum. That's not correct. The other thing that a lot of students that come to that class had a lot of experience with was customer service. Maybe they worked at McDonald's or worked as a cashier at a retail store. Well, so much of the museum world is providing customer service and teaching. So make sure you emphasize that. Maybe you babysat for your younger brothers or kids in the neighborhood. That you have experience with kids, experience educating them, or you were a lifeguard, you taught. So I always encourage the students to think broadly about what your experiences are, and don't think that whatever you've done doesn't translate into the museum world, because it does. And it's all training, and it's all ways that you can emphasize how you can do this job and ways to sell yourself a little bit to the organization. So don't be so narrow-minded, like, well, I've never cataloged an object before, or I've never put together an exhibit or done historical research or whatever. Yeah, that's part of it, but there are so many other skills that are involved in working in a museum that you may have that you don't think are going to be important, but you should emphasize those. And so that was one of the other messages to my students, is to make sure they sell themselves in that way.
I really like that. I almost want to say everybody should do a little short stint in the museum, because you might learn something that you didn't realize. But I like the point of like learning the shop stuff, because there could be a person who's, into the trades or wants to get into carpentry or building, and maybe their thought process is, well, I got to just go be a laborer and build houses, or I got to start from here. But, well, no, maybe you could see if there's a museum that needs someone to build the exhibits, and you could end up, and maybe you have a little bit of an artistic side. So instead of just doing the same routine framing walls and slapping them up, you could kind of combine those things and, again, add something from your building aspect to a museum exhibit. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, totally. And we had people at Air and Space that were metal workers, welders, full time. They were welding artifact mounts and display mounts, and just being incredibly creative with that skill. And again, you wouldn't think of someone being a welder working at the Smithsonian, the Air and Space Museum, but these guys did amazing work. And again, you never know what skill is going to translate or what's going to be needed. So the other thing I learned at Smithsonian was forklift operation. I learned how to drive a forklift. I drove cranes. I was deathly afraid of heights before I got there, but we had to learn how to drive like those basket lifts that elevate you stories off the ground, because when we were hanging the aircraft on display, they had to be raised up with a crane, and then you had to connect all the dots. And I remember thinking that one of the first days I got there, it's like, well, it's sink or swim time, man. You either are going to do this or you're not going to do it. You're going to do it safely. But there were a lot of skills working at a place where you just don't pick up and move an aircraft by hand. You've got to know, you got to have the proper tools to be able to do it. And so to learn that side of it as well, along with, I love history and I'm into researching all about the aircraft or the history of this pilot or something. Yeah, that was part of it. But the other part of it were the hands-on blue-collar skills that went into doing the job as well, that I took away with, and that's fun. And whenever I drive my wife crazy, because when we see a forklift, I always say to her, I could go over and start that up and move it. I was trained by the government of the United States to run that.
I know that
forklift.
model. I've driven a few of those before.
Yeah, that's it's a propane model, whatever. So it's little things like that are part of the business. Part of that museum unique education or employment experience. So if any of your people listening to this, don't limit yourself or think that your own experiences or what you've done on a previous job doesn't apply, because it all applies.
I love that about museums and libraries and institutions like that, is you can come from any background, come to that location, to that museum, that library, and you don't need a special degree to get in, and you can take away what you want to take away from it. I just think these places are so special in that regard.
Yeah, they're very unique, and it's a great opportunity for. We're in the education business. We're in the leisure time tourist. That's part of it as well. But at its core, what we're doing is at a museum is you have a goal or a collections focus, right? You're limited by either a certain geographic region or a time period or something. Museums, sometimes they get into trouble because they don't have that collections focus, and they kind of collect, whatever comes through the door. And then it's not focused in to one. You have to limit what you want to collect, because you can't take everything. You don't have the space, you don't have the time, you don't have the materials, you don't have the expertise for it. So having that solid collections policy will help you limit what comes through the door and have a scope of what you're collecting. But then it also helps you educate, and because you interpret using those objects. What makes a museum unique, no matter whether it's art, history, technology, or whatever. We teach our patrons, our public, using those objects, right? You get them up close and personal with those three-dimensional objects that were inspiring or used. And I think that's what separates a museum from, say, a library or another cultural center, is that we teach using those 3D objects. We present them, we teach, and that's what makes it cool and unique, is the collection is really the heartbeat or the core of any strong museum.
Well, and then certainly if there's artifacts or things that maybe you can't see anywhere else. I'm kind of curious about that. Is there certain things here that just items, artifacts that are the kind of almost one-of-a-kind category. It's like, this is the only museum that has one of these. Do you have some of that stuff here?
Yeah, and the thing that pops to mind is 2 letters written by a woman named Carolyn Quarles. Now, Carolyn Quarles was enslaved in St. Louis. She was born in 1826. In 1842, at the age of 16, she bought a ticket. She crossed from St. Louis. She escaped. And she began a journey on the Underground Railroad from St. Louis to Milwaukee. Now, remember, this is 1842, so this is before Wisconsin is even a state. She journeys at the age of 16 from St. Louis to Alton, Illinois, all the way to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She falls in with people, abolitionists, living in the Milwaukee, Waukesha region, who are going to take her to Canada because she knows and they know that she cannot remain in a so-called free state, free territory like Wisconsin. She could easily been captured with very little question and brought back to St. Louis. And in fact, harboring her in Wisconsin was illegal. You could be arrested and fined a lot of money for doing that. So Carolyn is taken by a man named Lyman Goodnow, who lived in Waukesha, to Canada. Now, when you're in Milwaukee today and you want to go to Canada, I often ask people, what direction of travel were they going to head? North, south, east, or west? And everybody says north, right? You're in Wisconsin, we need to get to Canada, we're going to head north. But Carolyn and Lyman head south. Now, think about your own experiences. You're in Milwaukee and you need to get to Detroit. You're on Interstate 94. You're going to head south, down from Milwaukee, past Kenosha, around Chicago, up through northwest Indiana, and across Michigan to Detroit, where all that separates Detroit from Canada is the Detroit River. You either go over the Ambassador Bridge or a tunnel. You can go. And that's the journey that Goodnow and Carolyn Quarles take. They go from Waukesha down around Chicago, up through Indiana, across Michigan. What does that have to do with your question about artifacts? 38 years after they make the journey, Carolyn is still living in Windsor, Ontario, where Lyman Goodnow left her. They hadn't spoken. Goodnow knows nothing about her life since they left each other 38 years prior. But Goodnow wrote her a letter. Carolyn Quarles, care of Postmaster, Sandwich, Ontario. Took a complete stab in the dark. Is she still there? What's, living what? Well, lo and behold, the letter found Carolyn. It's delivered to her. And she wrote 2 letters back to Lyman Goodnow, talking about her life and talking about the journey that the 2 of them made together in 1842. We have the letters here in our collection. And I think it's really unique to have a primary source document like that from someone who actually traveled the Underground Railroad, talking about their life, talking about the journey, what they remembered about it, directly to the person that helped them on that journey. And so for me, we base a lot of our interpretation about the Underground Railroad and freedom seekers here in the Upper Midwest around the letters and the information that Carolyn provides to us in her own words. So I think having those letters and using them in a school group program or to teach people about the experiences here in the Upper Midwest prior to the Civil War is incredibly powerful. And they're very unique to have something like that. So when I get excited about what we have, there are a number of objects here. Those 2 letters are incredibly powerful and really cool.
Well, and it alludes to a whole story there. We were just talking about earlier about movies and perceptions from movies. I'm surprised nobody's picked up that story and tried to, sure they'd sensationalize it and it wouldn't be fully historically accurate. There'd be a lot more action and suspense or something. But that's really, I find that fascinating. She came all the way up from St. Louis and then had to, come back down around and, who knows what they experienced on the way. And it's really cool. The letters are the only thing you have to infer what that journey was like.
And speaking to entertainment, we have taken the letters, and Goodnow wrote an account in a local newspaper up in Waukesha. That's why he was asking me these questions. We've taken those 2 accounts, and we've written a script. We have a professionally acted 1-act play that talks about Carolyn Quarles' life, and we've been doing it here at the museum for 15 years. For school groups or for community groups that come, it can be done here at the museum. We can take it on the road to schools, to organizations. And it's incredibly powerful because we meet Carolyn as she's receiving the letter from Goodnow 38 years after the journey, and she's writing the letter back to him. And in the play, she's describing, it's kind of like one of those, let's prequel type things. Let's go back. And so we've taken that letter and taken Goodnow's account and written our own deal for it and our own script, and it's really worked out well. It's a great story, and I can't recommend it enough. It's a great learning piece, again, because people are invested. They get emotional in the story, and they're going to remember that. If you're emotionally invested in something, I think you have a better chance of retaining it.
Yeah, almost to instead of just going by and there's random unnamed people, just maybe there's a image of them or maybe they are just faceless, but that really can zero in on, like you said, being able to empathize with a character, hearing what they actually put on paper. I think that is really powerful.
Yeah. Plus the fact that when we have a high school group that comes in, Carolyn was 16 when she made this journey. She made this decision to seek freedom, to leave on her own accord. And the kids I thought she was my age when this happened. And she made that decision. I think, again, it personalizes it. It brings that kind of full circle for them, and it speaks to them. So that's one of my favorites that we have. We have multiple things downstairs that I could bore you for hours about things that we have in the collection that we've used or display. But to me, there are certain keynotes down there that are really neat. And that is something that I think separates that story, and that collection kind of separates us from other institutions.
I do have one, a more fun question.
Okay.
I don't know what you had next.
No, I was just going to ask for
because we still need to know what
homework.
the homework assignment. Yeah, my one fun question is, because we're talking about movies and night at the museum where things come to life at night.
I was going to say, how accurate is that?
No. But I was going to ask you as more of a fun question, if you could pick one character to come to life, to have a conversation with one night, which would it be? And maybe Carolyn is already the answer, but I'm just curious if you have a specific character that you would just, I'd kill to just have one conversation with them.
The obvious one, I think, for a Civil War museum person is Lincoln, right? I think he would be a fascinating person to sit down with. But for me, it's Ulysses S. Grant. Grant grew up, or he was living as an adult when the war broke out in Galena, Illinois, which isn't far from where I grew up. Grant's story is one of, here's a guy who had success in the military, but then kind of had some alcohol troubles. And he had his ups and downs. He had to resign from the military because of his drinking habits before the Civil War. Was living in St. Louis with his wife on a farm he called Hardscrabble. Was selling firewood on the streets, kind of down on his luck. And then he gets instilled in Galena because his father has a very successful tannery business, a leather business. And his brother is basically running what you would call today like a branch of the family business. But his brother is getting sick. He's got a debilitating disease. And so the father sends him, Ulysses Grant, up to Galena to help his brother run that branch of the business. And I think if you would have asked anyone in Galena in 1860, in 8 years, one of your citizens is going to be president of the United States, elected president of the United States. Which person in the city of Galena is this going to be? I don't think Ulysses S. Grant would have been high on that list. And so I find his story of leadership and his personal journey incredibly interesting for a variety of reasons. Geographically, kind of the ups and downs that he experienced. In history too, like Grant was a very low person in United States history in the 1920s. And now it's funny like how people's reputations kind of ascend and descend as generations go on. Grant right now is thought very highly of. His star is kind of on the rise. Historians are taking another look at not only his military career, but also his presidency. Because for years he was thought of as one of the most incompetent and worst presidents that the United States had ever had. But people are reviewing that, and there's been this kind of revision of Grant's his personality, his military career, and also his presidency. So I think he would be a really interesting person to talk to. He was kind of that humble. I think he would get his honest opinion, and I think he would just be a person that I'd really want to talk to. So Night at the Museum, that you bring it up, right after I left the Smithsonian, the second one, Night at the Museum 2, they filmed at the Smithsonian. And my division that I worked with, my colleagues were in charge of the collection. And so when the museum crew or the Hollywood crew came to film it with Ben Stiller and I can't remember the female lead, Amy, somebody.
Oh yeah. What is her name?
I don't have it. I don't know it.
But the thing about it is, I asked him. I said, "What were your experiences with them when they came?" And because they filmed all this, and they said, "Oh, Ben Stiller was the greatest guy. They had so much fun with the whole cast. They said they were all great, and so it was a really cool thing." And so the whole night at the museum thing, we use that here because kids are familiar with it, and I'll tell them, we have mannequins in our exhibit, and sometimes the mannequins down in our exhibit kind of freak the kids out because they have a little audio feed in their chest.
Yeah.
And so when you walk by them, that's what triggers the audio. And if you don't tell the kids ahead of time, you're going to lose them because they're going to get so fixated on like, oh my, that thing just talked. So I will tell them about Night at the Museum. I say, I've slept in this museum more times than I care to tell you. And that's true. I have spent the night here several times. But none of the exhibits come to life. I've never had that happen to me. And they all
That
laugh.
you know of.
They all laugh. And then we kind of use that. Okay, that's our icebreaker, right? We can get beyond that. And if we just throw it out there on the table and use the movie and use that popular culture that everybody's seen, that really helps me with when we're doing a group. So it all applies. Knowing this stuff and knowing what the kids are going to be interested in, there's no tool that you can't use to get their attention and to have fun with them.
Yeah, I'm sure there's always times where you're going to get something like, oh, it would be a boring museum or something like that. And interaction like that could probably help get people, into it a little bit more.
Yeah,
and not think, oh, this is just going to be a boring field trip or something.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're not Great America. We're not Action Territory, but we have some cool stuff to offer.
Yeah. There's
Amy Adams.
There you go. Yeah, they spoke so highly of them and their experience with that movie. The people that I used to work with made me wish. Oh man, I wish I would have left a couple years later.
Yeah.
And got a
Dang
chance
it.
to do that. But yeah, that was good for them and good for the image of the museum too.
So, at the end of our shows, we like to ask our guests if you could give us a little bit of homework or something that we could do to apply what we talked about.
Even an exercise or something just to
Yeah.
kind of stimulate or get you thinking outside your own box. And
Right. What I would suggest for people who are listening, might obviously, if you spent this much time with me and listening to this guy drone on and on, think about your own career, I think maybe your own experiences. If you're getting in, you're kind of launching your own career, no matter what it might be, whether it's museums or you're interested in being a teacher somewhere, or you're kind of evaluating your own personality and interests. Take stock in everything you've done in your life, all your work experiences, all your personal experiences, and think about this all applies to what I want to do in the future. And don't discount anything. And maybe go back and look at your own resume, right? And what that couple sheets of paper, if you're trying to sell yourself or tell a potential employer, or if you're interested in that first internship, this is what those people on the other end have to go by. This is what the impression that I'm going to make. Don't discount that babysitting, that work at McDonald's at the counter, or working retail, or that shop class experience you might have. Reevaluate your own life, what you're at, what your experiences are, and don't be afraid to list that and to talk about it. Because oftentimes what you're going to find is that it will apply in some way to what you want to do and where you want to be in the future. It's all a path that we're on, and your past experiences, I think, will show that you have some experiences that are applicable to what you want to do in the future, even though in your own mind you think, God, this is a complete waste of time. This person doesn't want to know about this. This doesn't apply at all to what I want to do with that organization. But you never know what that one thing might be. And so reevaluate, take a look, and don't be afraid to emphasize or talk about it in a cover letter, or talk about it in a resume or a CV or something like that. So that would be my homework assignment for your listeners out there: is reevaluate yourself and don't be afraid to put that down.
I love that, because I've kind of tried to give people that advice too. And that, again, like I mentioned before, I was a little bit in that boat at one point where I had to look at myself and figure it out. So
Well, thank you so much.
No problem.
Yeah,
Thanks for the
that's-
invitation.
yeah, this was great.